can only follow models so far, but at least they are giving us a glimpse of what we could be seeing, especially as businesses here sit closed. If the models are accurate, it means these businesses could start reopening a month from now. Now, the study looked at every single state. In some states, they said could start easing social distancing as early as May 4th. Others have to wait until after the first week of June. Here in Washington, we sit in the middle. The models from UW estimate we can begin reopening come May 18th, but there are some conditions to make that happen. That includes that there needs to be a very low infection rate to begin reopening. What they're calling that is about 1 infection for every 1 million people. It also says relaxing social distancing is possible with containment strategies. That are things like implemented testing, contact tracing, and isolation of confirmed cases, and restricting large gatherings. Now, the big talk nationally has been, when are we going to begin increasing the testing capacity in the United States? President Donald Trump saying he would invoke the Defense Production Act to force production of more test swabs, and that is because public health officials are urging that testing capacity in the U.S. either needs to double, possibly triple, before we can start reopening the economy. But that May 18th date is what the model is saying if we can start getting widespread testing in effect. So something to keep an eye on for sure. For now, live in Seattle, Callie Greenberg, King 5 News.